This training is about finding a way to think about our experiences of the COVID-19 epidemic and its impact on our professional lives. It attempts to answer two important questions. The first is, how can we be psychologically robust enough to work effectively with the children in our care? And the second is, what can we do to allow the children to feel safe, cared for, and able to play and learn? It looks at these two questions through three broad themes. The first is the trauma of loss, the second, the power of relationships, and the third, the potential for growth. It uses four interacting frames throughout to look at these broader themes. The first is a global perspective, then a national, a community, and finally a personal perspective. The section on loss suggests that we're going through many interlocking cycles of grief. Naming it as grief, recognising that it is a process and that this is playing out at different times and levels throughout society, will empower us to recognise it where it appears and allow us to show ourselves and others some compassion. It uses the metaphor of being squished in an economy seat on a long-haul flight to help us understand the situation and why we need to be kind to ourselves and others rather than impatient. Relationships suggests that the only way we're going to get through this with our sanity and humanity intact is by supporting each other and working together. It uses a metaphor of a poop in a swimming pool to understand how we need to work together in a larger frame. It then thinks about our individual relationships and the qualities we need to nurture them. The final section is growth, and growth suggests that a crisis is also an opportunity and explores the idea of post-traumatic growth. It tries to think about how we can monitor our responses now to maximise our capacity to thrive even in extremely challenging circumstances. It's the first time in any of our lifetimes that we've had to deal with or live through anything like a global pandemic. It automatically thrusts us out of our personal frame into a much larger, broader global one. Events happening on the other side of the world have a direct impact on our day-to-day lives. The fact that global events really need dealing with on a global level can render us feeling quite powerless. This constant shifting of frames from the global to the national, to the community, to the personal and back again, can feel exhausting and unsettling and disorientating. And the sense of not having much control over your destiny is difficult, it's challenging. We have very little power or control on a global level, marginally more on a national level, and significantly more on the community and personal levels. By focusing on what we can control on an individual and community level, we have a much greater chance of securing better outcomes for ourselves and others. Even if the trauma of losing someone close to you due to COVID-19 has not touched you, the psychological effects and toll of the whole crisis affects all of us. On an individual level, for example, how do any of us even conceive of acknowledging or grieving for tens of thousands of lives lost? Even the experience of lockdown triggers feelings of grief for how life used to be. At the point of maximum restriction for me, I had a feeling that it was almost as if being on a long-haul flight in one of those really uncomfortable seats at the back of the plane, squished between two people, unable to sleep, unable to relax, and still countless hours to go before you arrive somewhere. Some of your friends and family members are also on the flight but in a different part of the plane. You're not sure they're okay. What's worse is that the in-flight entertainment system is only showing news which is both compelling and addictive because it talks about the flight you're on, the possibility that it might crash or enter turbulence, but it just makes you feel more stressed the more you engage with it. The flight is full and you're not sure if they're going to run out of food before the flight attendants get to you. The queue for the toilet is long. Will there be any toilet paper when you get there? You'd brought a book with you to read and a notebook to get on with some work or a creative project, but you just can't concentrate because you're feeling anxious. I think the unsettling thrum of feeling that we're all experiencing, particularly in between times, is one of loss or grief. A sense of grief reverberating through all the different frames or perspectives. It's almost as if we're being taken on an unchosen journey and not sure where we're going or when we might arrive. What is it that we've lost? On an individual level, this might vary, but it could include the loss of a loved one. It might be the loss of a job or a job that's radically altered. It might be missing friends and family and not having regular access to them. It might be the loss of going out or travel. Or it might simply be grieving for our normal ways of life. For each individual, it's likely that the loss will be different, and it's likely that the reactions and the timing of those reactions to the loss will be different as well. According to the mental health charity Mind, grief affects different people in different ways, but it is common to feel panic and confusion, as if our identity is changed or under attack, anger or hostility, to feel overwhelmed or as if you're not coping, relief, for example, if the death occurs at the end of a long illness, or you were acting as the main carer, or if the relationship was difficult, or mixed feelings. A popular way to conceptualize the process of grief was formulated by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and David Kessler. It comes with the caveat that it is a culturally encapsulated model that hasn't been empirically proven, but it does provide a nice description of common reactions to grief. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross herself stated that the stages of grief might occur in any order, and they might last for varying amounts of time. The different stages of grief are denial, where feelings of shock, disbelief, panic or confusion might occur. You might say to yourself, how could this happen? Or it can't be true. The next stage is anger. So blaming yourself or blaming others and hostility are all common feelings and behaviours at this stage. You might say things like, why me? This isn't fair. I don't deserve this. The next stage is bargaining. So feelings of guilt often accompany questions like, if only I'd done more for the person. If I'd only been. The next stage is depression, where you might be feeling tired, hopeless, helpless, like you've lost perspective, isolated, or needing to be around others. Everything feels a struggle, and you might ask yourself, what's the point? And the final stage in the original model was acceptance. And acceptance does not mean that somebody likes the situation, or that it is right or fair, but rather that it involves acknowledging the implications of the loss and the new circumstances and being prepared to move forward in a new direction. After the death of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and with the blessing of her family, David Kessler added a sixth stage to the model of grief. His sixth stage was called meaning, because he felt, after his own personal experience of bereavement, that the thing that he was really striving for in his anguish was a sense of meaning, a way to make sense of the whole. We have seen many of these responses play out within the different frames. For example, on a global level, there was denial that there was a problem and anger at the Chinese. On a national level, denial that the problem was real, that we needed to lock down. On a community level, anger at others for not following lockdown rules. On a personal level, perhaps some bargaining Well, you might say to yourself, I would feel much happier if only more tests were being given. Or, on the other hand, anger and denial, where you might say, I do not accept that this virus will affect my life. I'm just going to carry on as I please. Here is a list of attitudes and things to say that might support somebody who is experiencing loss or grief on an individual level. So do stay supportive and engaged, without the need or desire to fix the loss. So do say things like, I am sorry for your loss. I wish I had the right words. Just know that I care. Do be focused on feelings as they are happening in the here and now of the relationship. So do say things like, I don't know how you feel, but I am here to help in any way that I can. Do be able to sit with the feelings and do not offer solutions. So you might say, you and your loved one will be in my thoughts and feelings. My favourite memory of your loved one is... Do be able to acknowledge that they cannot change the situation for the better. So do say, I'm always just a phone call away. And do be tolerant of the other's feelings, so not requiring that they change them. And do say, nothing, just be with the person. And do be able to recognise the loss and not minimise it. So you might say, we all need help at times like this. I am here for you. And do be tolerant of the loss, not being time limited, and do not pressure the person to put a timeline on grief. So say something like, I'm usually up early or late. If you need anything, call me. What makes the situation even more challenging is that everyone is dealing with these losses in their own way and in their own individual time frames. It's no surprise that conflicts might arise if somebody is trying very hard to get on with things as a way of coping with their grief in a kind of denial mode, when somebody else might be feeling extremely angry or might even have come to a point of acceptance. These same kinds of difficulties can play out not just in our personal relationships but also in our professional relationships. And even on a broader scale, institutionally or even nationally. Another issue is that for some children and adults, home is not a safe place. During the global pandemic in the UK, domestic violence incidents have risen by 20%. For some children, the safest place for them to be is at school, particularly those with complex home lives or additional vulnerabilities or complex needs. School can be a deeply comforting and healing place. The ways in which children process loss and handle trauma can sometimes be in contrary ways to the way that we expect. Instead of sitting down with somebody and going through all the details of the traumatic event, what often is more helpful for the child is just to have an available adult to whom they might go from time to time. The psychiatrist Bruce Perry, when working with children that had survived the Wacko cult, found that they tended to regulate the amount of time that they talked about their traumatic experience, and would often talk to adults at unpredictable times of the day, for just a few seconds at a time. He felt that was a way for them to take charge of their own healing. Perry said, the kids were controlling who they talked to, how long it lasted, and what part of their experience they wanted to revisit. This is the first activity of our training today, and I'm going to ask you to pause the video in a moment. Now, take a moment to think about your personal losses during this period. Be gentle with yourself and think about how this crisis has directly impacted on you, your relationships and working life. Think about the future and what kind of consequences will this epidemic have on your life. And do you recognise grief as part of your emotional response? And if so, how? Take care while you do this exercise. It's definitely good to access and name what you're feeling, but only work to the point that feels manageable for you. Now spend a few moments just reflecting on this. pause the video while you do that. Instinctively, we've turned to relationships with others to support us at this time. Social media usage in the UK has increased by 40% during this period, and Zooming has stopped being a niche activity of business people and become a byword for COVID conviviality. This crisis was a jolt towards thinking more collectively, and where nationally that has occurred, there seems to have been greater success in containing the spread of the virus. Coronavirus is an international crisis, a global pandemic. It instantly forces us out of our individual concerns onto more international ones. Our world is very interconnected, not just via social media, but physically. Literally, the virus charted its way westwards. In fact, as the virus moved west, we were given the advantage of being able to see and learn from how other countries managed to contain the spread of the virus. The forces of denial were strong, though. According to American global outbreak expert Conyon Dick, on a national level, dealing with coronavirus is like dealing with a poop in a swimming pool. He uses the following analogy. Imagine you are at the pool and a kid poops in the water. What happens next? Everybody clears the pool. That is the initial step to protect people from the poop, but it's not the end of the story. There is a next step. Someone on pool staff has to go fish out the poop. It's a pretty thankless job. Then they have to shock the pool with chlorine to kill off bacteria, and then everyone waits half an hour or so until it's safe to swim again. You can see where I'm going with this. If the lifeguards tell everyone to clear the pool, but the pool staff declines to actually get rid of the poop, what happens? No one can get back in. The poop is still there, limbo. Whose fault is it that it's not safe to go back in the water? Who is accountable? Do you focus on the people saying, clean up the poop before we can go back in safely? Or do you focus on the staff whose job it is to clean up the poop? And what would you think if the staff started saying, look, just get back in the water, be a warrior? The answer is pretty obvious. So right now, our country is a big swimming pool with a poop problem. And the president, rather than fix the mess, is urging everyone back into the pool regardless and saying the real problem is those people who think that the pool's not safe yet. They must hate the pool, etc. And a lot of the public is buying it. The president's whole play here is to distract from his failure to fix the mess by focusing the country's attention on people who don't want to swim in a pooped-in pool. He wants you to believe they're saying you should never go back in. And if you buy that, he's off the hook. He doesn't have to clean up the poop, and he doesn't get blamed for failing to do so. Win-win for him. But no one is saying never go back in the pool. They're saying please clean out the poop first. Everyone wants to get back in the pool. Everyone wants to reopen the country. And if you're frustrated that we can't, please hold the right folks accountable. The problem isn't the people saying we need to reopen safely. It's the people saying we needn't bother with that part. Without getting cases down to a level where robust testing, tracing and quarantining procedures will enable us to contain outbreaks when and where they occur, we're just heading into a poop-contaminated pool. For some children, the epidemic and lockdown could have triggered a fight, flight, freeze response, rendering them very unsettled and unable to focus on their important relationships and schoolwork. Indeed, how far have all of us internalised the idea that others are a threat to life due to the virus? The ability to emotionally regulate is important. It is not possible to play or learn if your fight, flight, freeze response is triggered. The way that children acquire the ability to emotionally regulate is through their relationships with others. Bruce Perry writes that it is through patterned, repetitive neural stimulation provided by consistent, nurturing, predictable, responsive caregivers that the infant's brain receives what is needed to develop the capacity for healthy attachment and self-regulation capabilities. These types of beneficial interactions do not only come from the children's parents and carers, but from others too, including us. Perry writes that we must not undervalue the powerful therapeutic impacts of a caring teacher, coach, neighbour, grandparent, and a host of other potential co-therapists. Indeed, the greater the child's individual needs and experience of trauma, the greater the need for having a consistent and varied input of positive, repetitive rehearsals of healthy interactions and activities. These will often be regressive in nature, typical of children at an earlier stage of development, and need to be repeated so often that it would be unrealistic for one individual, such as a primary carer, school staff member, or therapist, to provide it on their own. The type of interventions that proved useful were some variety of somatosensory activity, for example, music, dance, walking, and drawing. This type of small, positive, constant reinforcing interaction is sometimes referred to as relational dosing. We're now going to move into another activity. The following areas are useful for developing emotional regulation: self-awareness, mindfulness, cognitive reappraisal, adaptability, self-compassion, and emotional support. Think to yourself, how many of these are you paying attention to in your own daily life at the moment? And what could you do specifically to cultivate each area? Pause the video for a moment while you reflect on this. Let's go through the most useful regulation skills with examples. Self-awareness. This might be something as simple as noticing and naming what we feel. Mindful awareness might be a formal meditation practice or mindfulness practice. Cognitive reappraisal. Skills might include things like thought replacement or situational role reversal. So if somebody snaps at you during the day, you might think what that person was going through to bring them to that point rather than blame yourself for it. Attentional control, so focusing on what you learnt from the conflict rather than the feelings of shame, stress or guilt that it might have provoked. Adaptability. Stress lowers our ability to life changes. So ask yourself what advice you'd give to a friend going through the same situation. Are you doing the same to yourself? Self-compassion / self-soothing. You might do things like positive affirmations, relaxation and breath control, breathing exercises. You might do a compassion meditation or loving kindness meditation or meditation with music. You might do a kind of self-reminiscence therapy where you try to recollect all the good memories we have had. Regular self-care, so giving yourself a hot bath, cooking a nice meal for yourself, or gratitude journaling, so writing down regularly all of the kinds of things that you're grateful for in your life. And emotional support, so knowing when to turn to others for help if you're feeling overwhelmed by a situation. Specific regulation skills for children might be in an adult modelling the right behaviour for them, asking them to delay their response time, so encouraging the child not to give immediate reactions, and that allows time for their fight, flight, freeze response to settle down. You might work on a child's emotional vocabulary, teach them about actions and consequences, and teach them how to detect stress within themselves. So on a personal level, where does all this leave us? What are the characteristics and qualities of relationships that nurture and support others? What is it that we need and the children need in these circumstances? And now it's time for another activity. Think of a person from your own life, perhaps childhood, but not necessarily, from whom you felt really supported, who encouraged you, accepted you unconditionally, and made you feel like a worthwhile person. And now think, how did this person convey this to you? Pause the video for a moment while you reflect on this. Referring to therapeutic relationships, the American psychologist Carl Rogers formulated his theory of core conditions, which, if met, would result in psychological growth for his clients. The three main core conditions are empathy, the ability to put yourself in other people's shoes, understanding someone's thoughts and feelings as they experience them. Congruence, the ability to respond in a genuine and real way to others. And unconditional positive regard, which allows the other person to speak without fear of being criticised or judged. There has been a lot of research in early developmental psychology about how a primary carer might show their love and care towards an infant, both verbally and non-verbally. The American psychiatrist Daniel Stern believed that mothers and infants shared affective states with one another in a process that he referred to as affect attunement or affective attunement. Largely unconsciously, mothers undertake a range of actions, vocalizations, touching, and other gestures that reflect and enhance some essential aspect of the baby's behaviour and presumed affective state. This can be cross-modal, but will match in some way. For example, if the baby raises its arms up and down in the air, the mother might mimic the movement with her voice, changing pitch, going up and down. The fundamentals of affect attunement are still at play in our interactions with older children. For example, to comfort an upset child, you would hardly approach them laughing and talking loudly. Instinctively, you attune yourself to what they're feeling, talking slowly and gently and giving them space to express how they're feeling. Additionally, we're hardwired to pick up on some of the feelings and affective states of those around us. Laughter and tears are quite contagious, for example. This stems from the same place as affect attunement, matching some element of feeling or behaviour, often in a different form. Thinking about interactions with children specifically, we might use the PACE method. PACE stands for playfulness, acceptance, curiosity, and empathy. Playfulness, acceptance, curiosity, and empathy are qualities that are helpful when creating emotional safety and when trying to stay open and engaged with another person. This, in turn, helps the other person stay open and engaged with you. These traits are similar to the attitude that parents routinely show when communicating with their own children. PACE focuses on the whole child, not simply the behaviour. It helps children be more secure with adults and allows them to reflect on their thoughts, feelings, and behaviours, building the skills that are so necessary for maintaining a successful and satisfying life. For children coming back to school, we want to communicate some basic truths to them. Steve Russell frames these as affirmations. Affirmations are short, positive phrases used to combat negative or unhelpful thoughts. He suggests that we think about how we can communicate the following affirmations to the children, not just through our words, but our behaviours too. We are pleased that you are coming here. Your needs and safety are important to us. We already have a connection with you. You can decide how you want to be here. We like you just as you are. You can be who you are. Now it's time for another activity. Thinking about Steve Russell's affirmations, how can we communicate the meaning of these affirmations verbally and non-verbally to the children? Take a moment to reflect, pause the video. The trauma expert Bruce Perry writes, "The bottom line is that healthy relational interactions with safe and familiar individuals can buffer and heal trauma-related problems." Indeed, for all of us at school, the small relational things that we do will be immensely important, such as nodding, smiling, and acknowledging each other. The important thing is to think about ourselves as humans first and then our designated roles. Nurturing healthy relationships with each other is an absolute priority and will act as a buffer for everything else. Traumatic and challenging situations nearly always provoke change, whether positive or negative, and in some circumstances can promote growth. In the middle of lockdown, after the initial shock had subsided, certain things started to become prominent, such as birdsong or noticing that the air was clearer through less pollution. For some, working from home, the time allowed them to recalibrate family relationships or notice things in nature, such as a tree in bloom or the routine of animals. For others, it led to a greater connection with the wider community, even if this was something simple, such as checking that an older adult neighbour had someone to fetch their shopping or that they were okay. A few journalists, noticing these subtle shifts in our attitudes, began to write optimistic articles about post-lockdown life and how desirable it would be to preserve some of these changes. It feels as though we're at a fork in the road, with one way leading to more of the same and the other way leading to some sort of change. On an individual level, there are three possible outcomes. The first is where things go back to how they were. This might take a while, but there's not a huge difference. The second might leave you stressed and mentally vulnerable. And the third might result in positive coping, or what is referred to as post-traumatic growth. Some studies suggest that nearly 90% of people experiencing trauma will show some aspect of growth. In some ways, feelings of growth can be an indicator of recovery after the initial shock of the trauma. Chowdhury writes that aspects of growth might appear in one or more of the following areas. 1. Embracing new opportunities, both at the personal and the professional fronts. 2. Improved personal relationships and increased pleasure derived from being around people we love. 3. A heightened sense of gratitude toward life altogether. 4. Greater spiritual connection. And 5. Increased emotional strength and resilience. The likelihood of a positive outcome and some personal growth from the trauma is higher when certain personal and environmental factors are present. Personal factors that contribute to positive post-traumatic growth include self-efficacy, emotional regulation, self-expression, confidence, radical self-acceptance, health, and past experience. The environmental factors desirable for post-traumatic growth are family, personal relationships, friends, colleagues, supervisors, teachers or guides, community, financial resources, and neighbourhood. According to the Complex Trauma Healing website, the individual personality traits that indicate an outcome of post-traumatic growth are optimism, where you're able to focus attention and resources on the most important matters and disengage from problems that cannot be controlled or solved. Conscientiousness, where you're better able to regulate your internal experiences and emotional states. Agreeableness, where you're more likely to seek support when needed and be able to receive it from others. Openness, where you're more likely to be curious, open to new experiences, emotionally responsive, and more readily reconsider your beliefs and values. And extroverted, where you're more likely to adopt problem-solving strategies, cognitive restructuring, and seek support from others. Here are some examples of post-traumatic growth, and in thinking about these, it's still possible to detect the pain, but it's transformed into something else. The first example might be parents that lose a child to cancer, who then go on to decide that they will donate money to cancer organisations or charities. The second example might be a child that loses a parent who then goes on to become more emotionally mature, grateful, and appreciative of other important relationships in their life in comparison to their peers. And a third example might be a person that loses their partner and in subsequent relationships develops deeper and more transparent relationships focused on the here and now and enjoying the present in the relationship. On a more superficial level, thinking about our jobs, not being able to do our jobs in the regular way has pushed us into being very creative in our professional practices. This is empowering and expanding, even if we might not have chosen to change our roles in this way in other circumstances. And now it's time for our final activity. Spend a moment to reflect on what positive ways has the crisis impacted on your professional practice. Think about what you have learned. Pause the video while you do this. This training has attempted to map out a path, thinking about loss, relationships and growth in relation to the COVID-19 epidemic, giving us a way to feel that what we're doing is mentally sustainable and worthwhile in relation to ourselves and in relation to others. One of the most tiring and unsettling aspects of living through the pandemic is having to unconsciously appraise ourselves and our actions in relation to global, national, community and personal frames. Before the epidemic, we rarely engaged with life beyond the personal and community. A second aspect is the pace of change. And a third is that every individual seems to be working their own way through these different issues at different rates. How does a person in the throes of grief for a lost way of life relate to somebody who is thriving on the change? How do we all work together when the crisis has left both children and adults going back to the classroom changed? Emotional regulation is key. There's a growing body of evidence, not just in a trauma-informed model, but across all mental health, that if a baseline of emotional regulation is achieved, more meaningful work can then follow. We need to think about this also in relation to ourselves and also in relation to the children that we work with. If we attend to emotional regulation, other things will fall into place. This might be done very simply by self-care or on a one-to-one level by being mindful of some of these key relational skills that we've talked about in the training today.